I have presided over thousands of cases in my lifetime, cases that tested the limits of patience, of law, of human decency. But I remember the morning she walked into my courtroom with a clarity that still lingers like a storm that refused to pass. I watched as the heavy oak doors opened slowly, deliberately, and she stepped in as though she owned not just the room, but every person inside it. Her heels striking the polished floor in sharp, echoing beats that seemed almost rehearsed, almost theatrical. She was dressed in a way that screamed wealth without apology. Designer fabric draped perfectly across her frame, sunglasses still resting arrogantly on her face despite being indoors, a handbag that probably cost more than what some families earn in a year hanging carelessly from her wrist. And yet, it wasn't the wealth that caught my attention. It was the attitude. The air around her shifted. I have seen arrogance before, but this was entitlement sharpened into something far more dangerous. From my bench, I leaned back slightly, my fingers interlocked, observing, always observing. Because in my courtroom, the truth always reveals itself, not through words alone, but through behavior. I remember the way she didn't sit immediately when instructed. Instead, she lingered, glancing around with visible disdain, her lips curling ever so slightly as though she found the entire system beneath her. I watched her attorney lean in, whispering urgently, clearly attempting to ground her, to pull her back into reality. But she brushed him off with a subtle flick of her hand, a gesture so dismissive it spoke louder than any words ever could. The courtroom felt it. The tension began to coil, slow and tight, like a spring waiting to snap. I have seen people nervous. I have seen people afraid. But this woman, she was neither. She was confident in a way that bordered on reckless. And I knew in that moment that this case would not unfold quietly. I adjusted my glasses slightly, allowing a deliberate pause to settle over the room. Silence has power, and I use it often. It forces people to reveal themselves, and she did, faster than most. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured, controlled, the kind of voice that carries authority without needing to raise volume. I called the case, slowly, deliberately, allowing each word to land. She responded, but not with respect. No, she responded with irritation, as if being there was an inconvenience to her schedule. I remember thinking, this will not end well for you. The case file in front of me was thick, far thicker than most civil matters, and that alone told me there was more beneath the surface than what appeared. I began flipping through the pages, slowly, letting the sound of paper turning echo faintly. Every detail mattered, every statement, every claim, and as I read, my expression did not change, but internally, I felt something shift. Because this wasn't just a dispute. This was damage, real damage. And the woman standing before me, she had caused it. The backstory began to unfold piece by piece. A small business owner, a hardworking individual who had spent years building something from nothing, a life built on effort, discipline, sacrifice. And then this woman entered the picture. I listened as the attorney outlined the events, her involvement, her demands, her influence, and how quickly things escalated from business dealings to destruction. I watched her as these details were presented. Her face remained unchanged, almost bored, occasionally checking her nails, her posture relaxed, as if she were watching a dull performance rather than hearing about the consequences of her own actions. I have seen denial, but this was different. This was detachment, and detachment in a courtroom is dangerous. As testimony continued, the truth grew heavier. The victim had been manipulated, pressured, cornered into agreements that were never fair, never balanced, agreements that were designed to benefit one side only, hers. And when resistance came, when the victim tried to stand their ground, she didn't negotiate. She retaliated. Contracts were broken, payments withheld, reputations damaged through calculated whispers and influence. I watched as the victim sat quietly, hands trembling slightly, eyes lowered, carrying the weight of something far deeper than financial loss. This wasn't just business. This was personal destruction. And still, she showed no reaction, not even a flicker. Her lawyer attempted to speak, to frame the situation differently, to soften the narrative. But she interrupted him. I watched it happen in real time. The way she leaned forward, cutting him off mid-sentence, her voice sharp, impatient. I don't need you to speak for me. The room shifted again. That moment, that single moment, told me everything I needed to know about her mindset. Control. She needed control, and when she didn't have it, she forced it. I remained silent, letting her speak, because sometimes the most powerful evidence is what people reveal about themselves without realizing it. She began explaining, or rather, justifying. Her words came quickly, confidently, laced with a tone that suggested she believed she was above consequence. She spoke about business, about power, about how the world works, and as she spoke, I watched the faces around the courtroom, disbelief, discomfort, even quiet anger, because what she was describing wasn't just strategy, it was exploitation, and she spoke of it as if it were normal, acceptable, even admirable. I felt my patience being tested, not broken, never broken, but tested. And I allowed her to continue, because I needed her to finish. The deeper we went, the clearer it became. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Every action, every decision calculated. I have seen people make poor choices. I have seen people regret. But regret was absent here, completely absent. Instead, there was pride. Pride in the damage, pride in the control, pride in the belief that consequences could be avoided, bought, erased, and that is where my concern shifted from legal to moral. Because the law can punish actions, but it also reveals character. When the victim was finally asked to speak, the room changed completely. I remember the silence before they began, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost suffocating. Their voice, it trembled at first, barely steady, but there was strength underneath it, real strength. They spoke about loss, not just financial, but emotional, psychological. The sleepless nights, the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being powerless against someone with more influence, more money, more reach. I watched as their hands tightened, as their voice broke, and still they continued, because truth has a way of pushing through pain. I listened carefully, every word, every pause, every breath, because in those pauses, there is truth. The kind that doesn't need exaggeration, doesn't need performance. And I could feel it, the weight of what they had endured. Years of work, undone in months. Trust, shattered. Stability, gone. And as I looked back at the defendant, she sat there, unmoved, completely unmoved. That was the moment, the exact moment. I knew this case would not end lightly. Inside, I felt something rare, something I do not allow often. Anger. Controlled, contained, but present. Because justice requires neutrality, but it also requires awareness. And I was fully aware of what had happened here. I maintained my composure because that is my duty. But internally, I had reached a conclusion long before the final arguments were made. When it came time for her to speak again, she leaned forward, confident, almost amused, and that's when she said it. Clear, loud, without hesitation. I buy people like you. The courtroom froze, completely. Even time itself seemed to hesitate. I remember the exact way the words landed, heavy, arrogant, final. And in that moment, she crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Not in my courtroom. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence stretch, long, uncomfortable, deliberate, because silence forces reflection. But she did not reflect. She smirked. That was her mistake, her final mistake. When I finally spoke, my voice was different, still controlled, but sharper, heavier. I reminded her where she was, who she was speaking to, and what the law represents. Not power, not money, not influence, justice. And justice cannot be bought. I began my ruling slowly, carefully, every word intentional. I dismantled her arguments one by one, exposing the flaws, the manipulation, the abuse of power. I spoke not just of law, but of responsibility, of consequence, of the illusion that wealth creates immunity. I have seen it before, and I have ended it before. Her expression changed, slowly at first, then all at once. Confidence cracked, arrogance faded, replaced by something far more human. Fear, real fear. When I announced the full extent of the penalties, financial, legal, and criminal. The room shifted again, this time not with tension, but with finality. It was over. She stood there, frozen, then began to speak, to argue, to plead, but it was too late. I had already made my decision. The bailiff stepped forward, calm, professional, and placed the handcuffs on her wrists. The sound, that sharp metallic click, echoed louder than anything she had said all day. I watched as she was led away, no longer in control, no longer powerful, just another individual facing the consequences of their actions. Months later, I heard about the aftermath, the fines, the charges, the loss of reputation, and the victim, slowly rebuilding, piece by piece, stronger than before. From my bench, I reflected on that day, on what it represented. Not just a case, but a reminder. Because in the end, money can open doors, influence can bend situations, but character decides how the story ends. And in my courtroom, arrogance doesn't win, it collapses. In the weeks that followed that day, I found myself revisiting the memory more often than I usually allow, not because the case was legally complex, but because of what it revealed about human nature when it is stripped of restraint. I remember sitting in my chambers late one evening, long after the courthouse had emptied, the echo of distant footsteps gone, the silence settling in like a heavy curtain, and I replayed her words again. I buy people like you. I have heard insults before. I have been challenged, doubted, even threatened in subtle ways. But that sentence carried something deeper, something colder. It wasn't just arrogance, it was belief. A belief that power is transactional, that integrity is negotiable, that people, judges, systems, justice itself are commodities. And I remember thinking slowly, deliberately, how many times has that belief worked for her before? How many doors had opened, not because she was right, but because she was rich? That thought stayed with me, because cases like this are never isolated. They are patterns. Patterns of behavior that go unchecked until they collide with something they cannot control. I later reviewed additional filings related to her case, documents that painted a clearer picture of her history, her business dealings, her methods, and what I saw did not surprise me, but it did confirm my suspicions. This was not the first time she had leveraged her wealth to dominate, to silence, to bend outcomes in her favor. Complaints had been filed before, quietly settled, buried under non-disclosure agreements and financial payouts. Victims who chose survival over prolonged battle. People who simply did not have the resources to fight someone like her. I sat there, reading line after line, each one adding weight to what I had already witnessed in my courtroom. And I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger alone, but something more controlled. A sense of responsibility. Because the law is not just about punishing the moment, it is about interrupting the pattern. And on that day, from my bench, I had done exactly that. The victim, I learned later, had begun rebuilding, slowly, painfully, but steadily. There were reports of small victories, reopening parts of their business, reconnecting with clients who had once turned away under pressure, reclaiming pieces of a life that had been fractured. I remember reading one statement, a simple line, "I finally feel like I can breathe again." That stayed with me, longer than any legal argument, longer than any testimony, because that is what justice should do. It should restore something, not perfectly, not completely, but enough for someone to stand again without fear. And I thought about that day in court, about their trembling voice, their quiet strength, and I realized something. Strength is not loud. It does not demand attention. It endures. And then, When the moment comes, it speaks. As for her, the woman who once stood so confidently before me, her world began to unravel in ways that no amount of money could immediately repair. Business partners distanced themselves, not out of morality perhaps, but out of caution. Reputation, once damaged publicly, becomes a liability, and she had underestimated that. I read reports of contracts being withdrawn, invitations rescinded, connections quietly severed, the kind of consequences that do not happen overnight, but accumulate steadily, like cracks spreading through glass. I imagined her, not in the courtroom this time, but alone, perhaps for the first time in a long while, realizing that control, once lost, is not easily regained. And I wondered, not with sympathy, but with curiosity, if she finally understood the difference between influence and accountability. I have always believed that a courtroom is more than a place of judgment. It is a place of revelation. People walk in believing one version of themselves, and often they leave confronting another. That day, she walked in believing she was untouchable, that her wealth placed her above consequence, and for a brief moment, just 60 seconds after those words left her mouth, that illusion shattered completely. I remember the exact look in her eyes, the transition, subtle at first, then undeniable. It is a look I have seen before, but never forget. The moment reality replaces arrogance, it is not dramatic, not theatrical, it is quiet, almost still, but it is absolute. And once it happens, there is no returning to what was. There are nights, even now, when I sit in silence and reflect on the balance I must maintain, the line between emotion and duty, because cases like this, they test that balance. It would be easy, too easy, to let anger dictate outcome, to let personal reaction override judicial discipline. But that is not justice. Justice is controlled, measured, precise. And on that day, despite everything she said, everything she represented, I remained exactly that. Not because she deserved restraint, but because the law demands it. And that distinction, that separation, is what gives the system its strength. Without it, we are no better than the chaos we claim to correct. I also think about the people who were in that courtroom, the observers, the staff, the young clerk who sat quietly in the corner taking notes, watching everything unfold. What did they take from that moment? What did they learn? Not from my ruling, but from her behavior, from the consequences that followed, because every case, every ruling sends a message far beyond the individuals involved. It shapes perception. It reinforces boundaries. It defines what is acceptable and what is not. And I can only hope that what they saw that day was not just punishment, but principle. That no matter how high someone stands, the law stands higher. Time moved on, as it always does. New cases came, new faces, new stories of conflict, failure, regret. But every so often, something would remind me of her. A tone of voice, a certain kind of confidence, the subtle hint of entitlement in someone's posture. And I would pause, just for a moment, remembering. Not out of fixation, but out of awareness, because patterns repeat in different forms, with different people, but the core remains the same. And each time, I am ready. Not with anger, not with bias, but with clarity. Because I have seen how quickly arrogance can crumble, and I have learned to recognize it before it speaks. I never saw her again after that day, not in my courtroom, not in any official capacity. But I did not need to. Some cases do not require follow-up because their conclusion is already complete. The lesson has been delivered, the outcome decided, the impact irreversible. And in a strange way, there is a finality to that which brings a certain kind of quiet. Not satisfaction, not pride, but resolution. The kind that allows you to close the file, place it aside, and move forward without lingering doubt. And so, as I sit here now, reflecting once more, I return to the same thought that has guided me through every case, every decision, every moment from my bench, a thought that remains unchanged, unshaken, and absolute, because no matter how much money someone has, no matter how powerful they believe themselves to be, No matter how many times they have bent the world to their will, there is one truth that waits patiently, silently, inevitably. Justice does not negotiate, and it does not forget. Even after all that had passed, after the verdict had been delivered, after the echo of those handcuffs had long faded from the walls of my courtroom, there were still moments, quiet, almost intrusive moments, where the memory would return with startling clarity. I would be seated at my bench, another case unfolding before me, another set of voices arguing their versions of truth, and suddenly, without warning, I would see her again in my mind, the way she stood, the way she looked at me, not as a judge, not as a symbol of the law, but as something she believed she could reduce, control, purchase. And I would feel that same stillness settle over me, that same internal reminder that justice is not just about what happens in the moment, but about what that moment represents in the larger pattern of human behavior. Because what she embodied was not rare. It was simply more visible, more exposed, and therefore more dangerous. I remember one particular afternoon, weeks later, when a young man stood before me in a completely unrelated case, his voice shaking, his confidence barely holding together, and yet there was honesty in him. Raw, unpolished, imperfect honesty. And as I listened, I found myself drawing a quiet comparison, not between their actions, but between their awareness. He knew he had made mistakes. He felt them, carried them, and in that awareness, there was something redeemable, something human, something worth considering. And it struck me then, more clearly than ever, that the true divide in my courtroom is not between guilty and innocent. It is between those who understand the weight of their actions and those who believe they are too powerful to ever feel it. She had stood on that line and chosen the latter without hesitation. There is a certain kind of silence that follows a case like hers, not the immediate silence of a stunned courtroom, but a longer, deeper quiet that lingers beneath the surface of routine. My staff felt it, though they never spoke of it directly. The bailiff, usually composed and detached, had taken an extra second that day before stepping forward. I noticed it, the subtle pause, the slight tightening of his jaw, as if even he, in all his experience, had felt the weight of what had just occurred. And that is the thing about moments like that. They ripple, quietly, invisibly, through everyone who witnesses them, not because they are dramatic, but because they are real, because they expose something that people often prefer to ignore. That power, when left unchecked, does not stabilize. It escalates until it collapses under its own weight. Sometimes, late in the day, when the courthouse begins to empty and the noise fades into a distant hum, I allow myself a rare moment of reflection without restraint. I sit there, alone, the bench no longer a position of authority, but simply a place. And I think about the responsibility that comes with it. Not the legal responsibility that is clear, defined, structured, but the moral one, the unseen one, the responsibility to recognize not just what is presented, but what is hidden beneath it, to see beyond polished appearances, beyond confident voices, beyond carefully constructed narratives, and identify the truth that exists underneath. That day, with her, the truth was not hidden well. It was spoken openly, boldly, without fear. And in doing so, she revealed more than any evidence ever could. And as I bring that memory to a close, as I let it settle back into the place where all past cases eventually reside, I am left with a certainty that has only grown stronger with time, a certainty that I carry with me into every courtroom, every decision, every measured pause before I speak, because no matter how loudly arrogance declares itself, no matter how confidently it walks into the room believing it cannot be touched, cannot be challenged, cannot be brought down, it always forgets one simple, unchanging truth. The higher arrogance rises, the harder justice makes it fall.